For this demonstration, I've loaded a separate project. This is a website named Retrieving Data Web, and to get this up, I went to the File menu, choose Open, Website, and selected this project from the set of projects for this course. Here we have a sample web page, and before we go there, let me show you in web.config, I've already added a connection string. You can see it here that points to SQL Express, just like before. Okay, so we're getting our data from SQL Express. Let's browse this web page just to see what it looks like. We have here a drop-down list with customer names. Once I choose a customer, we see all the orders for that customer on this web page. This is done with very little code using the drop-down list and grid view controls. And let's see how this works. To fill the customer list, we have a procedure named Fill Customer List. We'll call it from the page load event handler. And Fill Customer List does pretty straightforward stuff. This one first retrieves the connection string from that web.config. The way it does that is by using configuration manager.connectionstrings, passing in the name of the connection string. That gives them back a connection string object, and we have to retrieve the connection string property, which gets us the actual string. It's a little more complicated here because we've stored it in web.config and retrieved it using the configuration manager. Once you see how to do this, it's always the same. The SQL string we'll use to retrieve information is select customer ID from customer's order by customer ID. Now, there are easier ways to do this using tools provided by ASP.NET, but all I wanted to show off here was the code, so I'm not using those design time tools. If you're studying ASP.NET specifically, you'll want to investigate those. Using our connection string, we'll create a new connection, a new command, and open the connection, execute the reader. So this code's exactly the same as you saw in previous examples. Now, however, rather than iterating through all the rows, all we do is set some properties. We set the data text field of our drop-down list to be customer ID. If the value was different than the text, you could set the data value field as well, but it's the same. We only have the one column here. We set the data text field to be customer ID, the data source property to be the reader itself, and finally, call the data bind method to bind the results and display them on the page. That's all it takes, 3 lines of code. Set the data text field, the data source, and bind. No iterating, no looping, no nothing. That one line of code really does the work, right here. Specify the data source property, and you get the data displayed in that drop-down list. Now down here to fill the grid, it's pretty much the same thing. Get our connection string, build up our SQL string. We have a parameter here based on the value from that drop-down list. We'll need to satisfy the value of that parameter before we execute the query. We get the connection object, the command object, and down here, we need to specify the value for the parameter. Again, we call the addWithValue method of the parameters collection. Here's the name of the parameter. Here's the value of the parameter. It's the text of the selected item in the drop-down list. We execute the reader. We get our reader back. We specify the data source of the grid and data bind the grid. That's all the code there is in this page. So we've gotten the data for the drop-down list, we got the data for the grid, and we bind them to the data. Okay, there's one more thing we have to do. When we select an item in the drop-down list, we have to fill the order grid again. That is, fill in orders. Cause that grid to recalculate what data it should display. But that is all the code. And we've done this by binding the data reader to the grid or drop-down list by setting the data source property to be that data reader. Let's review what it looks like when we run it. Here we get the data. We didn't iterate through it. We just said, set your data source and go. We get the drop-down list. We've set the auto postback property to true, so it automatically forces a round trip to the server when I select an item, and that causes the grid here to change its values when we then push the value back to the server. It's easy to do. There are actually, as I mentioned, ways you can do this without a single line of code in ASP.NET. There are designers built into Visual Studio that write this code for you. But it's useful to see what's going on, and now when you do study ASP.NET and see how to use those designers, you'll see how they're writing their code and what it's doing.